In the folklore of the Gulag, everyone talks about the cold. They talk about the Siberian ice that turns breath into crystals, the frostbite that snaps toes off like dead twigs, and the snow that buries the dead until spring. And it is true, the cold is a killer. But if you survived the first circle of hell, which was the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp in the 1920s, you learned a terrible secret. The winter was merciful. The winter numbed you. The winter put you to sleep. It was the summer that you had to fear. Because in the short, humid, sweltering summer of the White Sea Islands, the air didn't just get warm. It got teeth. My name is Andre, and I was a prisoner in the Eslan, the Northern Special Purpose Camp. We lived in the ruins of an ancient monastery, sleeping in cells where monks had once prayed. But our god was the quota, and our devil was the mosquito. You might think I am exaggerating. You might think of a mosquito as a nuisance, a small itch on a summer evening. You have never been to the Solovki Taiga in July. The geography of the islands creates a perfect breeding ground: swamps, stagnant water, and dense birch forests. When the sun hits the water, the insects rise in clouds so thick they can obscure the sun. They are not just annoying, they are a biological force. They fill your nose, your ears, your mouth. The guards at Solovki were innovators. They were experimenting with how to break the human spirit before the system became an industrial machine under Stalin. They found that beating a man was tiring. It required energy. It bruised the knuckles. And sometimes, if an inspector came from Moscow, like the writer Maxim Gorky, bruises were hard to explain. They needed a way to torture us that was passive. They needed a way to inflict maximum agony without lifting a finger. And they found it in the forest. They called it putting on the mosquito. It sounds almost playful, doesn't it? Like a child's game. But the prisoners whispered the name with the same dread as they whispered firing squad. It was a punishment reserved for the stubborn ones, the intellectuals who refused to forget their dignity, the religious men who refused to stop praying, or sometimes just anyone the guards were bored with. I remember the first time I saw it happen. It was a humid Tuesday. The air was heavy and still, the kind of weather where sweat sticks to your skin like oil. We were cutting timber near the edge of the peat bog. The mosquitoes were already bad. We were wearing nets made of rags over our faces, wrapping our hands in cloth, doing anything to cover our skin. And then, the section commander, a man named Uspensky, walked into the clearing. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a coil of rope. He pointed at a man in our brigade, a young student named Sasha, who had been arguing about the soup rations earlier that morning. "You," Uspensky said softly. "You have a lot of energy today. You like to talk. Let's see if you can talk to the forest." We froze. We knew what the rope meant. Sasha turned pale. He dropped his axe. He looked at us, pleading with his eyes for help, but we looked away. In the Gulag, heroism is the quickest way to the grave. We stood silent, clutching our tools, as Uspensky and two other guards grabbed Sasha and dragged him not back toward the camp, but deeper into the green, buzzing darkness of the woods. The walk to the punishment site was short, perhaps only 200 meters away from where we were working, but it crossed a threshold into a different world. The forest floor here was spongy with moss and damp with the rot of centuries. The trees grew close together, blocking out the sky. It was a cathedral of shadows, and it was loud. A low, constant hum vibrated in the air, a sound like a high-voltage wire. It was the sound of millions of wings. I watched from the edge of the clearing, hiding behind a stack of logs. I needed to see. I needed to know the face of the enemy. The guard stopped at a large birch tree. It was an old tree with peeling white bark. Uspensky turned to Sasha. "Strip," he ordered. Sasha hesitated. "Citizen Commander, please. It's the insects. They will eat me alive." "That is the point," Uspensky smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was a bored one. "Strip or we beat you until you can't stand, and then we strip you anyway." Sasha, shaking with a terror that made his knees knock together, began to undress. He took off his padded jacket. He took off his shirt. He took off his trousers. He stood there, a pale, shivering figure in the gloom, his skin stark white against the dark forest. Even before they tied him up, the first scouts were landing. I saw him slap his arm, then his neck. Enough, Uspensky barked. To the tree. They pushed him backward against the birch trunk. They used the rough hemp rope to bind him. They tied his ankles, they tied his thighs, they tied his chest, and most importantly, they tied his hands behind the tree. This was the crucial part of the architecture of this torture. A man's natural instinct when an insect bites is to swat it. It is a reflex. By pinning his hands, they were removing his only defense. They were turning him into a buffet. Sasha started to struggle. "Please," he screamed, "just shoot me. Shoot me now." "Save your breath," Uspensky said, checking the knots. "You'll need it." The guards stepped back. They picked up Sasha's clothes, valuable state property, and folded them neatly. They lit cigarettes, the smoke creating a tiny island of safety around their heads. They looked at Sasha one last time. He was already twitching. Dark specks were landing on his chest, his shoulders, his face. "We'll come back for you at shift change," Uspensky said. "Think about your behavior." They walked away, laughing about a card game. They left him there, naked and immobilized. I stayed watching for a few minutes longer. The horror of the mosquito treatment is not immediate, it is cumulative. At first, Sasha was just shaking his head violently, trying to dislodge the bugs. He was blowing air out of his mouth to keep them away from his lips. Whoosh, whoosh. He twisted his torso, rubbing his back against the bark, trying to crush the ones biting his spine. But the forest communicates. The first mosquitoes released pheromones, signaling that they had found a blood source, a massive, warm, unmoving blood source. The hum in the air grew louder. It changed pitch. It became aggressive. I saw the dark cloud begin to descend from the canopy. It didn't look like insects. It looked like smoke. It swirled around his head. Sasha let out a scream, a long, ragged sound of pure despair. But the scream only opened his mouth, and the cloud rushed in. I turned away. I couldn't watch the feeding. I ran back to my work detail, my heart hammering, scratching at my own phantom itches, knowing that just a few hundred meters away, a man was being dissolved one drop of blood at a time. The rest of the work shift was a slow, agonizing crawl through time. We continued to chop wood, the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the axes echoing through the trees. But our minds were not on the logs. Our minds were 200 meters away, tethered to that birch tree. The psychological torture of the mosquito treatment wasn't just for the victim. It was for everyone who knew it was happening. We could hear the screaming for the first hour. It wasn't constant. It came in waves. First, it was the angry, frantic shouting of a man trying to fight back, cursing the guards, cursing the insects. Then, it shifted to a high-pitched pleading. He was begging God. He was begging his mother. He was begging for the guards to come back and put a bullet in his head. And then, around the third hour, the screaming stopped. But the silence was worse. The silence meant that the fight was over. It meant that the biology of the swamp had won. When the sun began to dip low, casting long, bruised shadows across the peat bog, Uspensky returned. He looked fresh, rested. He had probably spent the afternoon drinking tea in the guard shack. He clapped his hands. "All right, work detail. Tools down. Let's go collect our friend. He's had enough time to think about his attitude." We walked back into the forest. The deeper we went, the louder the hum became. It was a physical vibration in the air. The mosquitoes were still swarming, a chaotic, swirling nebula of black specks concentrated around the base of the birch tree. As we approached, Uspensky waved his hand to disperse the cloud. "Shoo! Get away!" he laughed, swatting at the air. I looked at the tree, and my stomach heaved. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. The figure tied to the tree didn't look like Sasha. It didn't look like a human being at all. It looked like a sculpture made of red, swollen clay. Sasha was alive, but barely. His body had reacted to the massive influx of venom. Every single bite, and there must have been tens of thousands, had triggered a histamine reaction. His skin had merged into a single continuous welt. His chest, his arms, his legs, everything was swollen to twice its normal size. He was a bright, angry crimson color. But the face was the stuff of nightmares. His eyes were swollen shut, two puffy slits in a featureless red mask. His lips were distended, cracked, and bleeding. His ears were unrecognizable lumps. The mosquitoes were still crawling on him, feeding on the eyelids, walking into the nostrils. He wasn't moving. He wasn't shaking his head anymore. He had entered a state of toxic shock. The sheer amount of anticoagulant saliva injected into his bloodstream had poisoned him. His heart was struggling to pump blood through the swollen tissues. "Well," Uspensky said, poking Sasha's swollen stomach with a stick, "did you learn your lesson? Are you going to give up the boots next time?" Sasha didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had swollen shut. He made a faint gurgling sound, a wet, rattling rasp that bubbled through his cracked lips. He was suffocating on his own flesh. "Cut him down," Uspensky ordered, looking bored again. "He looks like a tomato. Get him to the infirmary. If he lives, he works tomorrow. If he dies, well, nature is cruel, isn't it?" We rushed forward with our knives to cut the ropes. As I grabbed Sasha's arm to support him, I recoiled. His skin was burning hot to the touch. He was radiating fever, heat. It felt tight, like a sausage casing about to burst. We caught him as he slumped forward, a dead weight of agony. We dragged him out of the forest, swatting the remaining parasites from his body, but the damage was done. The poison was inside him. We carried him back to the camp on a makeshift stretcher. The other prisoners stared as we passed. They stopped talking. They took off their hats. They knew exactly what had happened. They saw the red, swollen monster on the stretcher, and they saw their own future if they dared to defy the administration. Sasha didn't die immediately. That would have been a mercy. He lingered for 3 days in the infirmary. I visited him once. He was lying on a cot, his body still swollen, his skin beginning to turn purple and black as the tissue necrosis set in. He couldn't see. He couldn't speak. He just lay there, shivering violently as the fever ravaged his brain. The doctor, a prisoner himself who had no medicine to give, just kept wiping his forehead with a wet rag. "His kidneys are failing," the doctor whispered to me. "The toxicity is too high. It's like snakebite, but 1,000 times over." Sasha died on the 4th morning. And this brings us to the most terrifying part of the mosquito treatment. It wasn't just the pain, it was the erasure. When the official death certificate was written up in the administration office, Uspensky didn't write torture. He didn't write exposed to insects. He wrote, "Cause of death, heart failure due to weak constitution." And technically, he was right. Sasha's heart had failed, but it was a lie that protected the system. If an inspector from Moscow looked at the body, they wouldn't see broken bones. They wouldn't see the marks of a whip or the burn of a cigarette. They would see a body that looked like it had suffered a severe allergic reaction or a disease. There were no bruises to photograph. The evidence of the crime was the forest itself, and the forest doesn't testify in court. We buried Sasha in the mass grave behind the monastery walls. We didn't mark the spot, but the lesson was marked on us forever. The guards at Solovki had proven that they didn't need complicated machines to break us. They didn't need electric shocks or racks. They just needed to strip us of our clothes and introduce us to the wild. In the years that followed, the mosquito treatment became a legend in the Gulag archipelago. It spread from Solovki to the camps in Siberia, where the midges, the ganus, could be even worse. It was the ultimate weapon of the state, passive, deniable, and absolutely terrifying. I survived Solovki. I survived the canal. I survived the war. But even now, 40 years later, living in a warm apartment in a city far away from the swamps, I cannot sleep with the window open. If I hear the whine of a single mosquito in the dark, I wake up screaming. I don't see a bug. I see Sasha. I see the red, swollen mask of a man who was eaten alive while he was still breathing. And I realized that the true horror of the Gulag wasn't the barbed wire. It was the realization that the guards had turned the earth itself into an executioner. And against nature, there is no appeal.